Tēnā koutou katoa, he tino mihi ki a koutou, kua tāmai nei ki tēnei hui rorohiko. He tino mihi ki a koutou katoa hoki kei roto I tēnei wiki o te reo Māori. Nō reira, ko te mea timatatanga o te hui nei, ko te karakia. Kia tau ngā manaakitanga te mea ngaro, ki runga ki tēnā o tātou, kia māhia, te hua mā kihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori hoki. Nō reira tūturu whakamaua kia tēnā. Haumi e hui e, tāiki e. So welcome to you all to today's Biological Heritage webinar. It's entitled A Matter of Trust, Perceptions of the Value of Risk Assessment, and it'll be presented to us by Melanie Newfield. Kia ora, Melanie.
Kia ora.
I'm Shaun Ogilvie, no Aotearoa me Aotearoa ho, and I'll be facilitating the session today. So just to start us off, a bit of housekeeping. There is a webinar help guide in the handout section on the webinar platform. So if you're experiencing any issues, please have a look at that. For the session today, we're going to have 15 minutes or roughly thereabouts, a presentation from Melanie, and then followed up by around about 15 minutes for questions. You can submit your questions via the questions section on the webinar dashboard. We'll do our best to answer all the questions that come up. If we do run out of time, there'll be a process at the end to follow up after the webinar. So a quick introduction quickly like to introduce Melanie. So Melanie is an independent contractor working in the areas of risk assessment, decision making and biosecurity. She worked as the manager of plants and pathways risk assessment at MPI for 11 years and was a risk analyst for plant health for 5 years before that. Prior to that, she worked on more practical aspects of risk assessment, prioritization and management of invasive weeds, and also did a bit of work on other invasive species as well. So now in terms of her topic for us today, there are dozens of published pest risk assessments and pest risk assessment frameworks, but only a fraction of them are actually used in decision making. So a crucial question is, what makes a pest risk assessment or framework useful to a decision maker? So Melanie's going to talk to us today about a study that she and her team have done to investigate that very question, and also to talk to us about the useful information that came out of that study. So kia ora, Melanie, I'll hand over to you now for the presentation.
Kia ora, Shaun, and kia ora koutou. Ko Melanie Newfield aho. I'm going to speak to you today about trust. I'm speaking to you from Wellington in my spare bedroom. And yeah, this is some work which is part of the project He Tangata He Taio He Ohanga, which is a values-based biosecurity risk assessment framework for Aotearoa. And this project, this overall program, has as its aim a more holistic consideration of values in risk assessment. So the values that are easy to count tend to dominate risk assessment, and this is looking more widely. It aims to achieve greater participation by participants in the biosecurity system, particularly mana whenua, and then just improve better risk assessments and better decision making. But as Shaun mentioned, there's a lot of frameworks already. There's a lot of risk assessments done based on frameworks, and they don't all get used. In fact, a lot of them don't. And so in order to make this project different, this program different, we've been looking at speaking to decision makers who use risk assessments and trying to understand what it is that makes them use a risk assessment and makes it useful. And so the approach we took is to do interviews with decision makers in the biosecurity system. These were what's called a semi-structured interview. So we had questions which we asked, but the answers were quite wide-ranging. I think they spoke from between 20 and I think about 80 minutes. So quite freely and widely about the topic of risk assessment and decision making. quite a few were from central government, you'll see the 12, but also local government and industry, and we had participants from a range of organisations, geographical areas and industries. And in particular, our approach was to try and get to cover the diversity of those decision makers. One point about the decision makers in the study is that quite a lot of them, they all made decisions in a biosecurity context, but they also were often advising others making decisions. So they all could answer questions both from the perspective of a decision maker and also as an advisor. And I think sometimes their answers were coming from the perspective of an advisor and sometimes from a decision maker. And the approach to this kind of research is it's qualitative research. Interview data is words, it's what people are saying, it's not something you can count and add up. So it's quite different. I'm not sure of the backgrounds of the people I'm speaking to, so I don't know whether you've got a social science background or, like me, have a more traditional, I've got traditional biological sciences background. So analysing qualitative data was new to me, and the method that I used for this is thematic analysis, and I've listed here a couple of key references. The 2006 reference is very widely used. It says thematic analysis in psychology, but actually it's used far more widely than that. And there's an updated, same authors have produced a sort of a manual handbook, which has just come out and updated. And so I used that for later research, but not for the original research because that was before it was published. And the process is really about becoming very familiar with transcripts of the interview. And so you're sort of reading through again and again, and you're taking segments of text and coding them with words or phrases that speak to the meaning of that segment of text, and then taking those codes that you're describing the segments of text and developing those into themes which describe a pattern of meaning in the data. And so I'm just keeping an eye on the time here, but I'm going fine. So for this particular project, I developed 3 main themes with some sub-themes, but I'm actually only going to talk about one of them today, and that is the one which I think, to me personally, it was the most interesting theme, but also it was the theme that I think has wider applicability to people who are producing research and providing advice in the hope that they'll lead to better decisions. And so that theme is trust is central to participants' views on risk assessment quality and usefulness. So whether or not the people I spoke to believed a risk assessment or acted on a risk assessment really came back to a matter of trust. And what I found is that the decision makers I spoke to, they trusted some risk assessments and they trusted some advisors, and there were others that they didn't trust. It wasn't so much a case that there were trusting decision makers and untrusting decision makers. It was more that they were graded. There were differences, but it was more a point that they trusted some and they didn't trust others. So there's quite a pattern there. And all of the more people I spoke to talked about trust in the advisors rather than the assessments, those doing the work. They spoke about it more often and they gave it much greater emphasis when they spoke. So that sort of came across as implying it's more important, and I've summarised that in the quote below. For me, it's also really important who's telling me that information. So that was a really core point that came out of the data. And so sort of digging into a little bit more detail with that, what did they say that trust related to? And the first point that came up was that the decision makers paid attention to the sources used. So this is when they're looking at assessment in particular. They would be looking at the sources that were used for that assessment. And there's sort of no surprises really in that. That's kind of what you'd expect. You want to know that people are using credible information, good sources. Another thing that the decision makers talked about was the knowledge and experience of the people providing the advice. Again, there's not really any surprises there. This is kind of what you'd expect and probably hope, that advisors that they saw as having a lot of knowledge and experience were trusted. So, but then we come to some more interesting and perhaps more challenging things that the decision makers spoke about when they spoke about trust. And one of the points that came up was the question of whether or not the advisors were perceived as understanding the context that the decision maker was working in. And there's a quote here which relates to a lack of trust rather than trust, that a decision maker was perceiving some advisors as being very siloed and providing advice from a very narrow frame of reference and not having a bigger picture view. And so effectively that was a reason that they might not fully take on board that advice. And it's not something you'd necessarily think of, but it was important. Another point that came up was perceptions about whether advisors were biased. And so there's a quote from one decision maker who's questioning whether or not the people advising them are thinking about the broader public interest, or whether they're coming from quite a biased viewpoint. Now, one of the challenges with doing qualitative research is you don't get data that you can say, right, well, we surveyed X number of people, we've got X degree of confidence that this applies to everyone else in this type of who's like this. So you don't get generalizable answers. What you get is more of a rich picture of what people are saying. But what we can do is look at what the literature says and see how that might relate. And what was interesting is I looked at two different models for what's important to trust in the literature, and this is one here, relates to environmental risk communication. And what's important is knowledge and expertise, and that relates right back to what the decision makers were saying about that knowledge and experience of the advisors. It relates to concern and care, and that I think potentially relates to understanding of context. But one decision maker spoke about the importance of having people with the right expertise and motivation. So it's not just being an expert. You've got to actually have that caring about what you're working on. Another point that comes up in the literature is openness and honesty. And I looked at the data, but I didn't actually see this coming through. So I wasn't sure why that's not there. You're never really sure whether it's the people you're asking, whether it's the person that you are, means that they're not raising those questions. But those were three factors that showed up in the literature. There's a slightly different model I've also looked at, which talks about competence, which again relates to that knowledge and experience, benevolence, which sort of links back to that concern and care, and I think that motivation, and integrity is another thing that came up. And one decision maker spoke about risk assessors approaching the problem as a scientific exercise rather than a real problem. I think that sort of goes to questions of that benevolence or the good intention again. So I think I said before, you can't generalize this data to all decision makers, and sorry, excuse me. You can't generalize it to all decision makers in the biosecurity system, but looking at the literature gives you some clues as to how applicable the data might be. And what's interesting is there's also an experimental literature on advice and decision making, and some points come up here. Decision makers are more likely to take advice from advisors they trust. trust is higher in advisors with high expertise and where they perceive the decision makers to have good intentions. And finally, that on a judgment task, which is where there's no right answer, decision makers are more likely to take advice from advisors they perceive as sharing values with them. So what I was seeing in speaking with the decision makers in the study, this is actually reflected in the literature for the models of trust and also experimental literature, which is generally done on psychology students at university. So not a great sample, but it's interesting. And it's pretty much brought me to the end. I'd like to thank Susanna Finley-Smith, John Keane and Christine Reed, especially Susanna for help with the methodology, taking a biologist and helping them do qualitative research. Ag Research has contracted me for this research, and New Zealand's Biological Heritage National Science Challenge has funded it. So thank you very much. There's my email if anyone wants to get in touch with me. And yep, thanks very much. And I'm going to go out of sharing my screen so I get pictures back. Thanks, Shaun.
Kia ora, thank you for that, Melanie. Just to remind everyone, if you've got any questions, just put them in the just ask them there in on the question section on the platform. I think just to start things rolling in terms of question and answer session, a bit of feedback there. I suppose, Melanie, for me, as I looked at your presentation, what was quite interesting, I suppose, is that kind of, I suppose in a sense, it's common sense that that there'd be an expectation of trust in the information. But I suppose it's that what's interesting to me is that kind of interplay between expertise and trust. And I suppose there must be a process that the decision makers go through around how they decide that the particular information is valuable, and that kind of interplay between that process and the trust side of things. So I don't know if you can tell us more about what you learned about the processes that those decision makers go through, about who they trust and why. That'd be valuable. Yeah.
One of the things that didn't come out so much in the study, but actually relates back to my own experience of being an advisor to decision makers, is there's a real challenge when you're coming from an expert, when an expert is advising a decision maker and the decision maker is not an expert. It's really challenging. The decision maker is not another scientist. They can't go and peer review your work. Yeah. So when you're a decision maker being advised by an expert, how do you know that expert's work is good? And you're not evaluating the work, you're evaluating that expert to see whether they know what they're talking about and to see whether they understand the context, if they understood what you've asked them. And so I think that, what the research shows is that how important it is for a non-expert, that they're actually needing to judge the person because they don't have a way of evaluating the work.
And I guess what kind of flows on from that is it's so important, that evaluation process, to be done well, I suppose, in terms of the follow-on good decisions that are made.
Yeah, and I think that's really challenging because it's telling you, if you're coming from an advisory perspective and doing the work and wanting to be understood, and you believe that you're providing this really good advice that will make a good decision, it's not just a matter of how good your advice is. It actually does relate back to how you're delivering that advice.
So the nature of the way that you deliver that information becomes quite important.
Yeah, it becomes important, and I'm not saying that's necessarily the ideal.
Yeah.
But that is the real world situation that we're in.
Yeah. Cool. We've got a couple of questions that's coming through. Kia ora, thanks for the presentation. What more can be done to improve the trust, and what role does risk communications play in that? So, yeah, just around that, I guess, processes in your view and your perception of improving that trust.
I think that if we go back to, I'm just going to briefly share the screen again. Sorry, I'll just pull that slide up. and pop that up there for you. Things like those factors of competence, it's obvious being actually good at what you do, but that understanding that concern and care, I think, is a really important one. People really do need to understand that you care about providing good advice and that you understand the context they're working in. And I know that in a work situation I had where there was poor trust and was really struggling to make advice effective because there was a lack of trust, we kind of hit a point where we started actually learning more about each other and learning. I learned that the decision maker I was advising did care about biosecurity, and that decision maker realised that I did care about all the context issues that they had, the constraints that they had on them as a decision maker. And as we learnt that we both cared about the same kind of thing and wanted the best outcome for New Zealand and biosecurity, trust developed and my advice became a lot more effective. So I think there is a lot that can be done by learning about how trust works.
I think related to that, Melanie, we've got another question that's come through, and you have to bear with me here. I kind of got to explain it, but it's how do we overcome that kind of confirmation bias issue, and what it's Kevin Collins asked this question, and what he's referring to there is that tendency to trust people that share the same values as ourselves. Like, how do we overcome that? And as decision makers, is it okay to say, I don't know you, and I know nothing about you, and I know nothing about the subject at hand, yet I'll trust your advice? Like, I guess it's to overcome that confirmation, that confirmation bias. I guess the decision makers have to get to that point, and how is that? How is it overcome, really?
Yeah, I think that's really hard. Like, I've mostly worked from a perspective of being the person who's advising the decision makers and having to look at what I could do to build trust.
Yeah.
And a lot of that came down to there's finding some common ground. I think some sort of establishment of common ground is really important. And one of the most powerful things I did early on when I was a manager was I sent all the staff who are risk assessors and writing from it in a very scientific way. I sent them all on plain English writing training, and they didn't all learn to write cabinet papers, although that was what the training was largely aimed at. But what I did was I committed to having a whole bunch of scientists learn more about making their writing easier to read. And it was not that the writing changed that much, it changed a bit. It was that the perception that I really cared about making the writing easier to read changed the perception of me and the perception of my staff. So I think if you're coming to it from a decision maker side, looking for where you can find common ground with someone is really important. I think it's incredibly difficult if you are, it's not just believing people with the same values, it's believing people who are like you. And
adding to that, like, do you feel like in the experiences that you had in those decision-making processes, there's actually the space and the scope and the time, I guess, to be able to go through that process of getting to that point of trust? Or I guess it varies quite a bit, I suppose.
I've had experience where it took me a very long time to build trust with people I was advising, and I had times when it actually just seemed to go really smoothly. And trust is also one of those things that it's the only thing I can think of that you are less likely to get if you ask for it. That is one of the things I learned about trust, is that, on virtually everything, you might as well ask for it. They might say no, but you're not going to do yourself any harm. Trust is different. But I think we really do have to think and work on the fact that we have this tendency to trust people who share our values, who look like us, who sound like us, who speak like us, who think like us, because we're not going to get the best decisions from that. The evidence is that you get too much into that groupthink mode. We know that greater diversity around the decision-making table leads to better decisions. It's
That's
challenging.
why Kevin's question was such a good question around that confirmation bias and how we kind of deal with that. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so one more quick question's come through, and you've got like a minute to answer it at the very most there, Melanie.
Yep.
But and that's like, what's next? What's planned for next in this part of the research?
In this particular research, we've been looking at finding some common ground on the question of what is a good decision, because there's no agreed standard of what makes a good decision. And if we could actually get a better understanding of that, that would leave us with a better way of finding common ground and agreeing, actually, this framework is useful because this gets us progress. We want a framework that actually gets us progress to what is a good decision. So I've written up the draft report. I've written up the reports, and I'm looking at doing a paper on what is a good decision in biosecurity.
Cool. That sounds awesome. Alrighty. Hey, well, we've got a minute left, and it's over to me now to just say thank you to you, Melanie. Well, certainly got me thinking, and I'm sure it's the same with the audience as well, that whole interplay between the decision maker and and I guess your own personal perceptions about whether you share values, or whether as a decision maker, whether the experts that you're connecting with have shared values. So that's there's a lot to think about there. But big thanks to you, and thanks to the team. Thanks to John Keane, who's actually there in the background, and he's there as a part of the team there as well. So thanks to you, John. I'll just finish now. I'll just close this off now with a karakia to finish. Thanks to the audience, everyone that's been involved with us today, and special thanks to those people that have asked questions that were able to allow us to have a bit of that discussion. So I'll just close this off now. Kia ora koutou katoa. Kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā. Manakitia mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau. Ai o ki te aorangi no reira, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna. Hau me e hui e, tā e ki e. Kia ora koutou katoa, ka kite.